Welcome viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale full of secrets, deception and unexpected twists, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. A museum that holds more than just lifelike figures, a body where there should be none, and a mystery that threatens to unravel everything. Don't forget to subscribe, for you won't want to miss what comes next. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Puzzle of the Waxwork Witness. Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the carriage and into the chilling embrace of the London fog. His tall, slender figure was swallowed almost entirely by the grey mist, the only sign of his presence the faint swish of his long coat trailing behind him. The streets were eerily quiet for this time of day. No clattering of horses' hooves, no chatter from the passing crowd. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Holmes, however, did not mind the silence. It suited his mood. His mind was already at work, analyzing every detail of his surroundings with precision. The invitation had been unusual, to say the least. A letter, its edges sealed with a broken wax emblem, arrived with a cryptic message. "Come alone, Mr. Holmes, and see the truth of the Waxwork Witness. Only you can unravel the mystery." There was no signature, no return address. The only clue was the emblem, a symbol that belonged to the St. Martin's Wax Museum. Holmes had accepted without hesitation. The museum loomed before him now, its darkened windows reflecting only the grey sky. As he approached, the grand building seemed less like a place of art and more like a tomb. The eerie silence of the fog clung to the structure, and the scent of old wood and wax hung thick in the air. A light breeze swept through the narrow street, rustling the corners of his coat, but he did not shiver. He had seen far more unsettling sights in his time, and this was only another puzzle to solve. As he entered the museum, the door creaked open with a sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness. Inside, the air was cooler than he expected, and the faint smell of burning wax mixed with the scent of dust. Holmes paused for a moment, taking in the sight before him. The wax figures, lifelike in their perfection, stood motionless in their places, frozen in time. Their eyes, glass of course, seemed to follow him as he moved, their expressions eerily vivid. Napoleon, Cleopatra, Shakespeare and countless others, all frozen in their eternal poses. It was a striking scene, and yet Holmes could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. His sharp eyes quickly scanned the room. There was a peculiar stillness to the air, an unnatural calm. The figures were too lifelike, too meticulously arranged, yet something in the positioning of some of them caught his eye. A slight tilt of the head here, an outstretched arm there. It all seemed too deliberate, too intentional. Holmes's gaze narrowed as he moved deeper into the museum, his footsteps muffled on the thick carpet beneath him. The curator had promised to meet him here, but there was no sign of him yet. Holmes's mind worked quickly, piecing together the puzzle. The invitation had come at a time when other distractions, more pressing cases, had weighed on his mind. Perhaps that was the purpose of this strange summons, to test his focus, to see if he could unravel a mystery in the midst of his distraction. "Interesting," Holmes murmured softly, almost to himself, his eyes fixated on a wax figure of a woman in an elegant gown, her hands outstretched as though reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The lifelike nature of the figure struck him as almost too perfect. He took a step closer, examining her face with the kind of attention reserved only for the most important of cases. Her lips were perfectly molded, her eyes seemingly alive. But it was the necklace that caught his attention, a fine silver chain, thin but glinting under the dim light. Holmes stepped back and observed the entire scene. It was as though this woman, her wax figure, had been designed to stand out in a way that the others did not. No other figure wore such a piece of jewelry. But why? What did it mean? Before he could further consider the implications of his observations, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway beyond. The curator, a tall, thin man with salt and pepper hair and sharp features, stepped into the room. His eyes were nervous and his posture slightly hunched, as though burdened by some unseen weight. He offered a strained smile. "Mr. Holmes, I am glad you arrived. I trust the fog did not delay you too much?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Holmes studied him with a cool gaze. "Not at all, Dr. Everett," he replied, his tone measured. "The fog, while unnerving, offers a certain clarity to one's thoughts. It is your museum, however, that seems to hold more intrigue than the weather." Dr. Everett's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes flickering to the figures around them. "Yes, well, this place can sometimes feel unsettling, even to those of us who work here." Holmes tilted his head slightly, observing the curator closely. The nervousness in his demeanor was apparent, though Holmes knew better than to rush to conclusions. "Unsettling?" he repeated, his tone thoughtful. "In what way?" Dr. Everett took a step toward the nearest exhibit, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "We've had a few incidents, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low, almost as if he feared being overheard. "Unexplained occurrences. Nothing too alarming, of course, but unsettling." Holmes's interest piqued, but he refrained from pressing further. Instead, he allowed a silence to settle between them, watching Dr. Everett's subtle fidgeting, the slight twitch of his hand, the way his eyes darted nervously to the wax figures. "You'll be happy to know," Dr. Everard continued, his voice faltering slightly, "that I've taken precautions to ensure no harm comes to anyone. But still, I had hoped you might be able to offer some insight into the matter." Holmes nodded. "I am intrigued, Dr. Everett, but before we dive into the details, might I ask, what exactly is it that you need from me?" Dr. Everett swallowed, then gestured toward the far end of the museum, where the figures of famous historical figures were displayed. His face grew more serious, his hands no longer fidgeting. "There is something I must show you, Mr. Holmes, something troubling." With a subtle glance, Dr. Everett led the way. Holmes followed, his senses alert, his mind already racing ahead, pondering what strange turn this investigation would take next. The museum hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with more lifelike figures. Napoleon at the height of his power, Cleopatra gazing serenely over a sea of loyal subjects, Shakespeare, eyes alight with the brilliance of his mind. Holmes's gaze swept over the portraits and busts, each frozen in time, each locked in its own world of history. Yet it was the human figures in the museum that stirred the most unease. There was something inherently strange about them, almost as if they were too perfect, too vivid in their stillness. Dr. Everett led the way, his footsteps quickening as he moved past the figures, casting hurried glances over his shoulder. Holmes noted the curator's unease, his pale skin, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his spectacles. The faint smell of wax, stale wood, and the lingering scent of dust clung to the air. But it was the subtle shift in Dr. Everett's demeanor that grabbed Holmes's attention. There was a nervous energy about him that didn't belong to a man who had spent his life surrounded by such stillness. At the end of the hallway, they turned a corner into a small side room. The space was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single flickering gas lamp overhead. It cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, further heightening the eerie atmosphere. Holmes's eyes immediately fell upon a young woman standing beside a display case. She was staring at the figure within, her face pale and drawn. "Mr. Holmes, allow me to introduce Emily Harper," Dr. Everett said, his voice strained as he motioned toward the young woman. "She is our assistant here at the museum." Emily turned, her gaze locking with Holmes's. Her eyes were wide, nervous, as though she had been caught in a moment of indecision. Holmes's sharp mind immediately took in her appearance. Dark circles under her eyes, a slight tremble in her posture, and the faintest sheen of perspiration on her brow. Her clothes were neat, but her hands were clasped tightly together, as though to prevent them from betraying her anxiety. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Harper," Holmes said smoothly, though his eyes never left hers. There was something about her demeanor that struck him as oddly familiar, but he could not yet place it. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was customary, allowing the silence between them to grow. He was waiting for her to break it. Emily swallowed, her lips parting as though to speak, but the words seemed to falter before they reached her mouth. She took a slow, steadying breath and then nodded. "It's an honor, Mr. Holmes." I've heard much about you." Holmes nodded but said nothing, allowing her the space to continue. He could see the conflict in her eyes. Something was clearly troubling her, but whether it was the museum's atmosphere or something far more personal, he could not yet say. Dr. Everett cleared his throat. "Miss Harper has been with us for quite some time now. She's been particularly helpful with the upkeep of our exhibits, ensuring everything is in order." His voice trailed off, as though uncertain whether to elaborate further. Holmes's gaze flicked back to Emily, noting the subtle shift in her expression as Dr. Everett spoke. There was a slight tightening of her jaw, a subtle flicker of something, anger, perhaps, that passed too quickly for him to read clearly. "Miss Harper," Holmes began, his voice calm and steady, "may I ask you something?" She hesitated before nodding. "Of course, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed her more intently. "Dr. Everett mentioned that there have been incidents. Could you tell me more about them?" The question seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Emily's gaze dropped to her hands, which she still kept clasped tightly in front of her. A moment passed before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure how much I can say," she replied, her eyes darting nervously between Holmes and the curator. "There have been odd things happening lately, but I assure you, nothing is out of the ordinary. Nothing to be alarmed about." Holmes watched her closely, his mind working rapidly to unravel the hidden layers of her words. "Odd things?" he repeated, his tone gentle but insistent. "Such as—" Emily hesitated again, glancing toward Dr. Everett, who was standing by the doorway, his arms folded tightly across his chest. His gaze flicked to Emily, then to Holmes, but he said nothing. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice quiet, but laced with an unmistakable hint of fear. "I don't know if I should be the one to tell you. Dr. Everett, he's been very protective of the museum," she said, her eyes now meeting Holmes's. "But sometimes when I pass by the exhibits late at night, I hear strange noises, whispering, and once I swear I saw one of the figures move." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Saw one of the figures move?" "Yes," Emily said quickly, as if trying to dismiss the absurdity of her words. "But I must have imagined it. The museum it's always so quiet, and I've been under a great deal of stress lately. I haven't been sleeping well, and—" "Emily," Dr. Everett interjected sharply, his voice tinged with something like urgency. "That's enough. You're being overly imaginative. It's merely the quiet that plays tricks on you." But Emily did not seem convinced. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but closed it again, her eyes downcast. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Holmes's gaze shifted between the two of them, noting the subtle but unmistakable strain in their interactions. There was something between them, something more than mere professional concern. The curator's protectiveness, his unwillingness to allow Emily to speak freely, hinted at deeper issues, perhaps even something he did not wish to confront. Holmes's mind worked quickly, noting the discrepancy in Emily's behavior, the unease in her voice, the subtle defensive posture when she spoke of the strange occurrences. Could she have been the victim of her own imagination? Or was there something more sinister afoot within the walls of this museum? Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, Dr. Everett cleared his throat again, breaking the silence. "Perhaps it would be best if you examine the exhibits yourself, Mr. Holmes. We have a few unusual occurrences that might benefit from your expertise." Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on Emily. "Yes," he said, his voice deliberate. "I believe it would be beneficial to take a closer look." As he turned toward the exhibits, Emily and Dr. Everett fell into step behind him, their presence casting long, tense shadows in the dimly lit hallway. The scent of wax grew stronger, as if the figures themselves were waiting for him to uncover their secrets. The exhibits stretched ahead in the dim light, their wax figures standing motionless, lifelike yet unnerving in their stillness. Holmes's footsteps echoed lightly through the silence, the faint creak of his boots the only sound disturbing the oppressive quiet. The air was thick with the scent of wax and aged wood, mingled with something else, a subtle, metallic tang, almost like burnt metal. Holmes's keen senses, finely attuned to even the smallest of details, noted the shift in the air as they passed through the rows of figures. Dr. Everett walked a few steps ahead, his hands clasped behind his back in a manner that seemed all too rehearsed, as though he were concealing something. Emily followed silently, her face pale, her gaze darting between Holmes and the figures, as if afraid to look too closely at them. Holmes, however, paid them little attention. His mind was already whirring with the possibilities, trying to make sense of the odd tension in the room, the strange words Emily had said, and the feeling that something was amiss. They rounded a corner into a smaller, less illuminated section of the museum, where the figures were arranged with a kind of eerie elegance, statuesque, frozen in mid-motion, locked forever in some moment of time. The faint scent of burnt wax was stronger here, the air growing heavier, almost thick with it. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he scanned the display cases. Something about the arrangement struck him as slightly off. He couldn't quite place it, but he felt it, the sense that one of these figures did not belong. Dr. Everett came to a halt in front of one of the displays. "Here," he said softly, as if speaking louder might somehow disturb the air around them. He motioned toward a glass case in the center of the room, its interior dimly lit, the figure it contained standing alone in its solitary splendor. Holmes stepped closer, his sharp eyes immediately drawn to the figure within. It was a woman, dressed in an exquisite gown, the fabric so lifelike it seemed to shimmer under the light. Her features were finely molded, perfect in every detail, but it wasn't the woman's appearance that caught Holmes's attention. It was the unmistakable sense of wrongness that clung to the scene. Her hands, delicate and poised, were outstretched in a gesture of reaching. Her face, though still and serene, seemed somehow strained, as if frozen in a moment of fear. And then there was the neck, oddly twisted as though it had been positioned at an unnatural angle, the skin a shade too pale. Holmes's gaze flicked to Dr. Everett. The curator's posture was stiff, his face taut with worry. "What happened to her?" Holmes asked quietly, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the air. He did not need to voice his suspicion. The tension in the room was enough. Dr. Everett's gaze dropped to the figure. She was Lady Cassandra," he said, his voice strained. "One of our finest pieces, a perfect replica of a woman of her time." He paused, his eyes flicking nervously toward the doorway as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. "But she's gone." Holmes's eyes did not leave the figure as he spoke. "The figure has been replaced." "Not just replaced," Dr. Everett replied, his voice dropping lower still. "The body inside. It's a real one." Holmes's heart rate did not quicken, but his senses sharpened, his mind already leaping to conclusions faster than he could articulate. He leaned forward, his gloved fingers brushing against the edge of the glass case. The faint scent of decay lingered around the woman, not the fresh wax of a new exhibit, but the faint trace of something older, something darker. His eyes flicked to the woman's face again, studying it closely. The features were too perfect, too well crafted, yet there was a subtle difference, the faintest curve of a muscle beneath the skin. The eyes were empty, the gaze unblinking, but they were not the lifeless eyes of wax. No. These were the eyes of someone long gone. Holmes felt a tightening in his chest as he stepped back from the case. The body inside, though perfect in its immobility, was not the work of wax. This was no sculpture. It was the body of a real person. The room seemed to close in around him. He turned to face Dr. Everett, his voice cool and precise. "You didn't say she was dead." I didn't know," Dr. Everett stammered, his face pale. We thought it was the wax figure. It wasn't until this morning, when I came in early to check the exhibits, that I realized something was terribly wrong." Holmes stepped away from the case, his eyes scanning the room once again. Something did not add up. He turned to Emily, who stood silently by the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had not spoken a word since they entered the room, but now, as Holmes approached, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the tremble in her hands. She was hiding something, he was certain of it. "Miss Harper," Holmes said, his tone deliberate, "did you notice anything unusual last night?" Emily's eyes flickered to Dr. Everett, and for a moment Holmes saw the briefest flash of something... fear? Guilt? She swallowed hard before speaking. I didn't want to believe it," she said softly, her voice strained. "But I thought I saw Lady Cassandra move last night. I saw her hand twitch, just a little. I thought I was imagining it, but now..." Her voice trailed off, and she fell silent, her eyes fixed on the figure inside the case, as though it might come to life and speak. Holmes's gaze moved from Emily to the figure once more. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the puzzle was far from solved. Who was the woman in the case? How had she ended up in the museum? And why had she been posed so deliberately to mirror Lady Cassandra's wax figure? His mind raced with the possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. This was no simple case of a misplaced exhibit or a harmless prank. There was something far darker at play here, and it was hiding behind the perfect facade of wax. Holmes took a slow, measured step back from the glass case, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of information. His eyes did not leave the figure of the woman, though his thoughts were racing. The body inside the display had been carefully posed, as though it were another wax figure, but the signs were unmistakable. The warmth still clung to the skin, the delicate veins beneath the surface that no artist could replicate. It was a human body, not a sculpture, and that simple fact turned the entire case into something far more dangerous. Dr. Everett had grown even more agitated, his hands trembling as he wiped them against his trousers. "I swear, Mr. Holmes, I had no idea. I thought it was a trick, an elaborate prank, perhaps. But when I saw her face this morning, I couldn't..." His voice trailed off, leaving the room heavy with his unspoken fear. Holmes glanced at him briefly, his expression unchanged, but the sharpness of his gaze never faltered. "A prank?" Holmes asked, his tone colder than it had been moments before. "You expect me to believe this was some form of artistic misdirection?" I don't know what to think," Dr. Everard said, his voice tight with frustration. "We've had strange occurrences before, Mr. Holmes, I admit that, but never anything like this." The curator's words only served to further stoke Holmes's growing suspicion. Something more than mere coincidence was at play here. A woman's body posing as a waxwork figure did not simply appear overnight, and the way Dr. Everett reacted to the discovery suggested that he wasn't just concerned for the museum's reputation, there was something more personal wrapped up in this mystery. Holmes shifted his focus back to Emily, who still stood by the door, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had been quiet for too long, her silence an unsettling contrast to Dr. Everett's agitated ramblings. Holmes took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Harper, you mentioned seeing the figure move. What exactly did you witness?" Her eyes flicked to the floor, and for a long moment she said nothing. The air seemed to thicken around her, the tension palpable. Holmes did not rush her. Instead, he waited. It was clear that whatever she had seen, it had left her rattled. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was late. I was checking the exhibits before closing. I walked past Lady Cassandra's display and I saw her hand move. Just a twitch, like she was alive. I thought I was imagining it. But the more I thought about it, the more I became certain. Something wasn't right." Holmes nodded slowly, processing her words. He could see the fear etched into her face, the way her hands trembled despite her best efforts to hold them still. But there was something else there too, an undercurrent of guilt or perhaps confusion. He couldn't tell yet. "You didn't think to mention this to anyone?" Holmes asked, his voice quiet but pointed. Emily looked up at him, her eyes brimming with a mixture of shame and anxiety. "I didn't want to cause panic. I thought it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. But when Dr. Everett found the body this morning—" She trailed off, her words faltering as the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. Holmes turned away from her, focusing once more on the wax figures around them. His mind sifted through the information, trying to piece together the most logical explanation. But each clue he uncovered seemed to lead to more questions rather than answers. Why had the figure of Lady Cassandra been replaced with a real body? And who could have done such a thing without anyone noticing? The curator, Dr. Everett, seemed to be genuinely rattled. But could he be hiding something? And Emily, with her nervous mannerisms and cryptic statements, seemed to know more than she let on. Without saying another word, Holmes moved toward the nearest display, where a figure of an old king stood in regal splendor. His gaze was fixed on the glass case, but his mind was elsewhere. The flickering gaslight above them cast long shadows on the walls, and the room seemed to grow colder, the temperature shifting as though the walls themselves were closing in. He had been to enough crime scenes to recognize the feeling. Something was off here, something hidden beneath the surface. Holmes approached the body once more, his gloved hand gently touching the edge of the glass. He could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. But there was something else, too. A sense of urgency, a knowledge that time was slipping away faster than he would like. There were answers to be found in this room, and he would find them, no matter how deeply they were buried. "Dr. Everett," Holmes said, his voice calm but deliberate, "I need access to your security records for the past few days. Every detail, no matter how small." The curator stiffened, his eyes widening slightly at the request. "The security records? But, Mr. Holmes, I don't see how that could—" "Do you have them or not?" Holmes interrupted, his gaze piercing. "This is crucial. We need to know exactly when the body was placed here. The sooner we uncover the timeline, the sooner we can piece together what happened." Dr. Everett hesitated for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, of course. I'll bring them to you immediately." As Dr. Everett stepped away, heading toward the back office to retrieve the requested records, Holmes turned back to Emily, who had retreated to the far side of the room. Her gaze was distant, her hands still clasped tightly together. "Miss Harper," Holmes said, his voice softening just slightly, "I need you to be truthful with me. If you know anything about this, now is the time to speak." Emily's eyes met his, a flicker of something, fear perhaps passing through them, but she said nothing. The silence between them stretched out for a moment before she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what happened," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush, "but I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I didn't want this to become something. It's all getting too real now." Holmes watched her carefully, his mind analyzing every word, every movement. Her fear was evident, but what exactly was she afraid of? The door to the back office creaked open, and Dr. Everett returned, a stack of papers in his hands. Holmes took them without a word, his eyes scanning the records with practiced speed. The timeline was filled with gaps, vague entries and half-hearted attempts to explain discrepancies, but one detail stood out. The night before, someone had entered the museum long after hours. The security footage from that time had been corrupted, the images too blurred to make out anything definitive. Holmes felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. Someone had come in during the night. But who? And why? Holmes sat back, the stack of security records spread across the table before him, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the scattered entries. The blurred footage, the odd timestamps, and the seemingly incomplete logs made little sense. His fingers hovered over the pages, tracing the dates and times that didn't add up, the gaps that suggested someone had intentionally erased or corrupted the evidence. He pushed the records aside with a sigh, his mind churning as he considered the possibility that he was dealing with a far more methodical and calculating individual than he had initially thought. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe someone is trying to cover their tracks?" Dr. Everett asked, his voice tinged with desperation as he stood behind him, wringing his hands together. Holmes did not look up immediately. His eyes were fixed on the papers, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "That is exactly what I believe, Dr. Everett. Someone in this museum has carefully erased all evidence of their involvement, but they cannot erase the truth." Emily, who had been silent up until now, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. Her posture had become increasingly rigid since the moment Holmes had begun to review the security records, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The tension in the air had thickened with each passing moment, and it seemed as though even the faint hum of the gas lamps above had grown quieter. Holmes could feel her unease, the subtle flicker of anxiety that she couldn't entirely mask. I don't understand," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "What if this was all just a mistake? I mean, you must see how it could have been an accident. Maybe someone just misplaced the body." Holmes turned to look at her, his gaze steady, but it was the way she averted her eyes that spoke volumes. "And yet, Miss Harper, you were the first to notice that something was wrong, weren't you? It wasn't an accident, was it?" Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers twitching as she picked at the fabric of her sleeve. I don't know what to tell you, Mr. Holmes. I saw what I saw, but I don't understand any of it. And now this—" She motioned vaguely toward the table where the records lay in front of them. "I never thought something like this could happen. I didn't want to believe it." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze intense but controlled. "Emily, you are hiding something. I need you to be completely honest with me. This is no longer about misplaced bodies or unusual events. This is about a life lost, a life that may very well have been taken by someone within these walls." Dr. Everett shifted uncomfortably behind her, his gaze darting between Holmes and Emily. "Miss Harper is just shaken. We all are. This place, this museum, it's like a sanctuary. It's not supposed to be a place of death." Holmes remained silent, letting the curator's words hang in the air. He could sense the hesitation in Dr. Everett's voice, the hesitation that belied the calm exterior he was trying so hard to project. Holmes studied both of them for a moment longer, then pushed the records aside entirely. The evidence was not in the paper, it was in the people before him, and one of them was lying. "Miss Harper," Holmes began again, his voice now softened but no less firm. "You mentioned a man named Edward earlier, did you not?" Emily's face paled, and for a brief moment she looked as though she might crumble under the weight of his question. Her lips parted, but no words came. It was Dr. Everett who spoke up first, his voice tense. "Edward, what does he have to do with this, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's gaze flicked to him briefly, then back to Emily. "Miss Harper has a connection to Edward, a man who worked here until his disappearance some months ago. She mentioned him in passing, yet something tells me he is crucial to this case." Emily's shoulders tensed, and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Edward he was my fiancé," she said quietly, her voice cracking slightly. "He worked here, helping with the displays. He was passionate about his work, almost obsessive. He disappeared one night without a trace and—" She faltered, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I never thought to mention it to anyone, but now I realize he might have had something to do with all of this." Holmes's brow furrowed, but he kept his voice even. "Edward's disappearance seems more than a coincidence now. What do you know of his work here, Miss Harper? What was he working on before he left?" I don't know," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was always secretive about his projects, but he spoke of creating new figures, ones that would be more lifelike than anything the museum had seen. I thought it was just an obsession, something he was passionate about, but now, I don't know. I feel like I've missed something, like I should have paid more attention." Holmes could feel the weight of her words, the guilt in her voice mixing with her unease. There was something deeper here, something buried beneath the surface. Holmes stood and moved toward the table, his hands clasped behind his back as he considered her words. Edward's disappearance, his obsession with lifelike figures, there was a clear connection between him and the strange events unfolding at the museum. Dr. Everett, who had been standing quietly at the periphery of the conversation, stepped forward. "Edward had become difficult, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice tight. "He was often in late, working alone. I told him we could not afford to deviate from the museum's traditional displays, but he insisted on these new designs. I tried to discourage him, but I couldn't stop him." Holmes turned, his eyes sharp as he focused on the curator. "And when Edward disappeared, you were content to let it go?" Dr. Everett's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "He left without any explanation. I couldn't force him to stay if he didn't want to. We all thought he had just left the city. We assumed it was a personal matter. But Miss Harper never did," Holmes pressed. "She stayed behind, unsure. That's why she's so unsettled now, isn't it? Because she knows something about Edward, something that she hasn't told anyone." Emily met his gaze then, her eyes wide and vulnerable, as though searching for some kind of relief. "I didn't want to believe it," she said softly. "But now, I see the signs. Edward, he wanted to create something more than just wax figures. He wanted to create something alive." Holmes paused, his mind processing the implications of her words. The notion that Edward's obsession could have led to the replacement of a figure with a real body was disturbing, but the pieces were beginning to fit. There was more at play here than a mere disappearance. The quiet of the museum felt almost suffocating as Holmes stood still, absorbing the weight of Emily's revelation. Edward, the man who had worked tirelessly to create lifelike wax figures, had now entered the heart of the mystery. His disappearance, once a distant and inexplicable event, now seemed to intertwine with the unsettling developments at the museum. There was something dangerous about his obsession, and it had somehow found its way into the present. But what was the connection between Edward and the murder? Why had he disappeared so suddenly, and why did Emily continue to harbour feelings of guilt about his work? Holmes took a slow breath, his mind racing. He turned toward Dr. Everett, who had remained quiet during the exchange. The curator's face was pale, his eyes downcast. There was something off about his demeanour, something that Holmes had noticed earlier but now seemed clearer. He had been far too evasive, too willing to push the strange events aside as harmless, as if hoping the truth would never surface. "Dr. Everett," Holmes began, his voice cool and controlled, "you've been very quiet since Miss Harper spoke of Edward. Is there something you're not telling us?" The curator stiffened, but his eyes remained on the ground. He shifted uncomfortably before meeting Holmes's gaze. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes." "I've told you all I know about Edward." Holmes studied him for a moment longer before responding. "You said you discouraged Edward from pursuing his new designs, but did you really? Or were you simply threatened by his growing influence here at the museum?" Dr. Everett's jaw tightened, and his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The silence hung in the air, heavy with his reluctance. The curator glanced at Emily, who was standing by the wall, her face a mask of apprehension. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time, Holmes saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "Edward," Dr. Everett finally muttered, his voice low, "was talented, but he was also difficult. He wanted to push boundaries, go beyond what we had established here. He thought that he could make the figures more than lifelike, that he could make them real." His voice faltered as he finished, and he seemed to shrink inwardly, as though the weight of his words had become too much to bear. Holmes took a step closer, his gaze never leaving the curator. "And you didn't think that was dangerous?" Dr. Everett looked away, his eyes momentarily clouded with a mix of guilt and something darker. "I told him it wasn't possible, that it was madness. But he wouldn't listen. He grew fixated on it. He became obsessed. And when he disappeared..." He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "When he disappeared, you simply let him go?" The curator flinched, his eyes darting nervously toward Emily before returning to Holmes. What else could I do? He was a grown man. He left on his own. No one could have stopped him. Is that so? Holmes's tone was sharp, the implications of Dr. Everett's words beginning to form a more sinister picture. You say you couldn't stop him, but you could have called the authorities. You could have told someone about his obsession. Dr. Everett's mouth opened, but he had no immediate answer. Instead, he glanced down at the ground as if the weight of his conscience had become too heavy to bear. It was clear to Holmes now that there was more to this story than the curator was willing to admit. Dr. Everett's failure to act, his decision to leave Edward's disappearance uninvestigated, now seemed more like a deliberate choice than simple negligence. Holmes turned his attention back to Emily, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of sadness and frustration. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her fingers still twitching nervously at her side. "Miss Harper," Holmes said, his voice softer now, though no less probing. "You mentioned earlier that Edward wanted to create figures that were alive, but you didn't explain how or why you continued to stay here, working in the same place after his disappearance." Emily opened her mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, as if the words were caught somewhere deep inside her. She swallowed hard before answering. "I stayed because I didn't want to believe what he had become. I thought if I just stayed, if I kept working, things would go back to normal. But they didn't." "And now?" Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, she looked away from home, her eyes clouded with a mixture of guilt and fear. Holmes's mind churned with this new information. Edward's obsession with creating more lifelike figures was dangerous enough, but now it seemed clear that it had somehow turned into something far darker. Emily had stayed, unwilling to leave the museum, perhaps because she felt guilty, perhaps because she felt tied to Edward in some way. She was holding back, and it was becoming more apparent that there was something crucial she wasn't saying. "You knew something, Miss Harper," Holmes said gently, but with a piercing intensity. "You knew Edward's plans, you knew what he was trying to do, and now you know that his work has crossed over from the realm of art into something much more dangerous." Emily flinched at his words, and for a moment it seemed as though she might collapse under the weight of her own emotions. Her hands trembled at her sides, and she shook her head as if trying to dispel the thoughts that clouded her mind. I didn't want any of this," she whispered, almost as though speaking to herself. "I didn't want it to be true, but now I see that it is, and I don't know how to stop it." Holmes took a step back, his gaze moving from Emily to Dr. Everett. The tension between the two was palpable, as if a chasm had opened up between them. The contradictions in their stories, the evasions, the hidden fears, it was all starting to make sense. The figures in the museum were not just art. They were part of something much more horrifying, a twisted culmination of Edward's obsession with creating life from wax. "You've both been hiding something," Holmes said finally, his voice sharp and clear, "and now it's time for you to tell me everything." The room seemed to grow colder as the truth began to emerge. The dark corners of the museum no longer felt like mere shadows, they felt like a grave waiting to be uncovered, and Holmes was ready to dig. Holmes stood in the center of the room, the dim light from the flickering gas lamps casting long shadows on the walls of the museum. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of revelations that had been long buried. The museum, which had once seemed like a place of quiet wonder, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, each exhibit hiding a piece of the puzzle he had yet to uncover. His mind raced as he mentally pieced together the fragments of information that had emerged over the past few hours. He turned back to Emily and Dr. Everett, both of whom stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Emily's face was drawn, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. Dr. Everett, once so assured in his responses, now seemed like a man unraveling at the seams, his previously confident posture crumbling under the weight of his own guilt. Holmes's gaze shifted to the security records that lay scattered across the table. the corrupted footage, the missing timestamps. There was a deliberate attempt to conceal the truth. And the more he thought about it, the more it became clear that the events unfolding in this museum were not random. They were the result of careful, deliberate actions. Holmes's mind turned back to the key pieces of information. Edward, the missing artist, had been obsessed with creating lifelike figures so realistic they could almost be mistaken for living beings. This obsession had been something he shared with Emily, something that had drawn them together before his disappearance. Yet, despite her apparent unease, Emily had remained at the museum, working alongside Dr. Everett, unwilling to leave the place that seemed so tied to Edward's legacy. Holmes paused, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as he looked at the two of them. Edward's obsession, he murmured, more to himself than to the others. It wasn't just about creating lifelike figures. It was about creating life itself. Emily flinched at his words, her eyes darting nervously to Dr. Everett before she quickly looked away. Dr. Everett, for his part, shifted uneasily under Holmes's unwavering gaze. "Go on, Mr. Holmes," Dr. Everett said, his voice strained. "What are you implying?" Holmes exhaled slowly, turning his attention back to the security records, his mind sifting through the facts. Edward wasn't simply making figures, he was trying to create something more. He wanted to animate them, make them real. He turned to face Emily. Did he ever speak of how he planned to do this? Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice low, as if she were afraid to give voice to the truth. He spoke of experiments, not just wax and clay, but something else. He said he was close, that he'd discovered something, but I didn't understand what. And then he... Holmes nodded slowly, his thoughts aligning. "The body of Lady Cassandra," he said, his voice calm but edged with a sense of finality. It wasn't just replaced. The person who put it there, they were trying to continue Edward's work. Dr. Everett's face paled, and he stepped forward, his hands wringing in front of him. No, you're wrong, Mr. Holmes. Edward's work was madness. I tried to stop him. I warned him, but he never went through with it. Holmes raised a hand, silencing the curator. "It's clear, Dr. Everett, that you're hiding something," he said sharply, his gaze penetrating. "You were more involved than you care to admit. Edward's work didn't stop with his disappearance, and you didn't stop him either. You allowed it to continue, didn't you?" Dr. Everett recoiled as though struck, and for a brief moment Holmes thought the man might crumble under the pressure, but instead the curator clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of defiance. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, more to himself than to Holmes. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking as she turned to Dr. Everett. "What do you mean you didn't have a choice?" Dr. Everett's gaze flickered to the floor, his hands now tightly clenched at his sides. "Edward was dangerous," he said quietly. "He had threats. He had a plan, and I thought if I let him go on, he would stop, but he didn't. He kept pushing. He was going to create something more than just figures, and I couldn't stop him. I couldn't." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. "What was he going to create, Dr. Everett? What was he planning?" The curator's hands trembled as he ran a hand through his hair, his voice a whisper of confession. He wasn't going to create just another wax figure. He was going to bring someone back, a real person. He thought he could use the body of a person, a living being, to power his experiments. But it all went wrong. That's why he disappeared. The room was suddenly still, as though the weight of Dr. Everett's words had sucked the air from the space. Holmes felt the full gravity of the situation crash down on him. Edward had been trying to create life itself, to bring someone back from the dead. But the experiment had failed, and now the museum had become the scene of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Emily's voice broke the silence. "So the body in the exhibit, it wasn't just some mannequin. It wasn't just a mistake." Holmes turned to her, his expression grim. No, Miss Harper, it was a human being, a real person, and someone went to great lengths to replace Lady Cassandra with a body to keep the experiment going. Emily stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who would do that?" she whispered. "Who could do something like that?" Holmes's mind raced as he turned the pieces over in his mind. The body in the exhibit, the strange behaviors, the corrupted security footage, it all pointed to one person. "It wasn't just Edward, Miss Harper," Holmes said, his voice hardening. "It was you, too. You knew what he was planning. You were helping him all along, weren't you?" Emily's face went white, her eyes wide with terror. No, I didn't help him. I didn't know what he was doing," she cried, her hands shaking as she stepped back further. Holmes's gaze never wavered. "You stayed here because you believed in his work, because you couldn't walk away. But you knew what he was capable of, didn't you?" The silence between them was deafening, and Emily's eyes darted between Holmes and Dr. Everett. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Holmes took a slow breath, his voice now calm but filled with an undeniable certainty. Edward's legacy didn't die with him. It lives on in this museum, and it's not done yet. The air in the museum felt suffocating now, the oppressive silence pressing down on all three of them. Holmes's mind was working furiously, sorting through the clues that had been laid before him, each one leading him closer to the truth. Edward, with his obsession, had set something in motion that had only just begun to unravel. The museum was not just a place for preserving the past. It was a vessel for something far darker, something unnatural. Holmes stepped back, his eyes shifting from Dr. Everett to Emily. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. The curator's confession had only deepened the mystery, and Emily's unease had become a visible tremor in her movements. She had stayed at the museum, hoping that Edward's experiment was just a distant memory, but the truth could not be so easily ignored. "Miss Harper," Holmes said, his voice steady but cutting through the silence like a blade, "you didn't just stay out of loyalty to Edward. You stayed because you knew he wasn't truly gone, didn't you?" Emily's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She took an instinctive step backward, as though trying to put distance between herself and the man who had begun to see through her defenses. Her gaze flicked to Dr. Everett, who stood silently, his face pale with fear, as if he were a man waiting for judgment. I didn't know how to stop it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "When Edward disappeared, I thought it was over. But after he left, things started happening. The figures, they felt different. I could hear his voice sometimes, and then the body came. The woman in the exhibit. Holmes's eyes softened for just a moment, though the weight of the situation pressed against him. "You thought you could keep it hidden, keep it from becoming something real. But it was never just about figures. It was about resurrection, about defying nature itself." Emily's face crumpled as the truth settled over her. "I never wanted this to happen," she choked out, her hands clasped tightly together, her body trembling. "I thought if I just helped with the work, if I just kept everything running smoothly, it would stop. I didn't realize until it was too late." Holmes's gaze hardened as he turned toward Dr. Everett. The curator had remained quiet throughout the exchange, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his posture rigid, as if bracing for what would come next. "Dr. Everett," Holmes said, his tone sharp, "you knew more than you let on. You were just as involved in this twisted legacy as Miss Harper. You knew about Edward's plans, and you chose to let them continue." Dr. Everett's eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and fear. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried to stop it, but it was too far gone. Edward had made too many connections, too many promises. I couldn't." "You couldn't stop him because you didn't want to," Holmes interjected, his words cutting through the curator's weak protest. "You were complicit, Dr. Everett. You allowed Edward's madness to continue, and you covered it up when things began to spiral out of control." A tense silence fell over the room. Emily's gaze remained fixed on the ground, her hands still trembling. Dr. Everett's face was flushed with shame, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. The truth had been laid bare before them, and the weight of it was suffocating. Holmes's gaze narrowed as he walked slowly toward the glass display where the body of the woman, Lady Cassandra's replacement, stood. The figure was lifelike, too perfect in its stillness, and yet there was an undeniable wrongness about it. The twisted neck, the unnatural pose. This was not the work of an artist trying to capture life. This was an attempt to mock it. He turned back to face Dr. Everett and Emily, his voice calm but edged with a quiet fury. The body in the exhibit, it wasn't meant to be art, was it? It was an experiment. Edward's experiment to bring someone back to life. You were all part of it. Dr. Everett took a step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. We didn't know, Mr. Holmes. We didn't know how far Edward would go. I never imagined it would come to this. He spoke of bringing figures to life, but I didn't think it would lead to this. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You didn't think, or you didn't care? Edward was desperate, obsessed, and you, both of you, allowed him to continue, allowed this madness to thrive in the name of your precious museum. Emily's face paled, her breath shallow as she stepped back. I never wanted this, she repeated, her voice breaking as she sank into a chair, her hands pressed to her face in anguish. I never wanted to be a part of this. I thought I could help, but I was wrong. I didn't know what I was doing. Holmes's expression softened for a moment, but his words remained firm. You were complicit, Miss Harper, whether you knew it or not. You allowed it to happen. The room felt colder, the weight of the truth pressing down on them all. Holmes felt his chest tighten as he watched Emily's breakdown, her fragile facade crumbling under the pressure of her guilt. Dr. Everett, too, seemed defeated, his role in the entire affair revealed for all to see. There was no escape now, no way to turn back. Edward's legacy lives on in this museum, Holmes continued, his voice quiet but filled with a sense of finality. The body of the woman in the exhibit, it's not just a result of his work, it's a warning. He stepped closer to the display, his gaze fixed on the lifeless figure. The experiment isn't over, it's only just begun. The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of the mystery not yet fully resolved, and as Holmes turned back to face the two remaining conspirators, he knew that the truth would lead them down a darker path, one that neither he nor they could escape. The museum was unnervingly quiet now, as if the very walls had absorbed the dark secrets that had unfolded within them. The gas lamps flickered, casting uneven shadows that stretched across the room like silent witnesses to the tragedy that had taken place. Holmes stood by the display, his gaze lingering on the lifeless figure of Lady Cassandra, now revealed as nothing more than a grotesque echo of the twisted experiment that had gone so wrong. He could feel the weight of the case pressing on him, its conclusion not as satisfying as he would have liked, its answers as troubling as the questions that had led him here. Dr. Everett and Emily stood in the corner, both of them drained, their faces ashen from the confrontation. Dr. Everett's hands were still trembling, his posture sagging under the weight of his guilt. Emily, too, was broken, her eyes red and swollen from tears, the strain of the past hours evident in every line of her face. Holmes turned away from the display, his sharp eyes flicking to the curator first, then to Emily. You were both complicit, he said, his voice low and unyielding. Whether through intent or ignorance, you allowed Edward's madness to continue. You allowed him to bring death back into this museum under the guise of art. And now, because of that, there is no undoing it. The words, though not harsh, seemed to reverberate through the still air, each one a heavy weight on the two of them. Dr. Everett winced, his mouth opening to respond, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, a reluctant admission of his failure hanging in the silence between them. I never wanted to hurt anyone, Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she spoke. I thought it would stop, but it never did. She glanced toward Dr. Everett, her expression filled with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I didn't know he would push it this far. Holmes watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. He could see the conflict in her sense of guilt, her regret, but also the confusion of being trapped in something far beyond her understanding. Edward's obsession had pulled them all into his madness, and now they were left with nothing but the wreckage of what had been. "The truth is, Miss Harper," Holmes began, his voice steady but tinged with quiet reproach, "it was never going to stop. Not until someone intervened. You did not realize it, but you were just as much a part of this as Dr. Everett." Emily nodded, her face crumpling as if each word Holmes spoke was another burden she had to bear. "I wanted to believe it would stop. I wanted to believe that the worst was behind us." She wiped her eyes, her voice growing weaker with each passing moment. "But now it feels like it's too late. We've let it go too far." Holmes turned toward the door, his fingers brushing against the cold brass handle. The museum felt like a tomb, the weight of the mystery now lifting, but leaving a profound sense of emptiness behind. The body in the display, the clues that had led him to this moment, none of it brought any true satisfaction. There was no joy in uncovering a twisted truth like this. There was only the quiet aftermath of a life lost, and a corruption too deep to easily erase. "We will need to involve the authorities," Holmes said, his voice sharp, breaking the stillness. "The body in the exhibit must be examined, and this museum must be investigated thoroughly. This case cannot end here." Emily looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with the rawness of the truth. "But what happens to us?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Holmes turned to face her, his expression softened only slightly. "You will have to face the consequences of your actions," he said. "The authorities will decide what becomes of you, but your involvement in this madness, cannot be overlooked." Dr. Everett nodded, his face lined with regret. I understand. I never thought it would go this far. I should have acted sooner, but I thought I could contain it." Holmes paused for a moment, the silence stretching between them. The museum, once a place of wonder and intrigue, now felt more like a prison, a monument to human folly and ambition that had gone too far. Holmes's gaze moved once more to the figure of Lady Cassandra, now nothing more than a twisted remnant of Edward's failed experiment. "The lesson here," Holmes said quietly, his voice distant as his thoughts turned inward, "is that obsession, when left unchecked, will always lead to ruin. And it does not matter how much one tries to hide from the truth. Eventually it will find its way to the surface." The finality of his words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, drifting slowly yet steadily across the room. There was no more mystery here, no more clues to uncover. The pieces had all been placed, and the truth was now exposed for all to see. But the consequences of the events would reverberate long after the museum doors closed behind them. Holmes turned away, his gaze fixed firmly on the door. "I will ensure that justice is done, Miss Harper, Dr. Everett, but it is up to you to face what has happened here." As Holmes walked out of the museum, the cold night air hit him, sharp and unforgiving. He could still feel the weight of the case in his bones, the sense that the dark corners of the world would always have their secrets, no matter how hard one tried to uncover them. He would leave the museum to the authorities, and he would let them sort through the wreckage. But for him, the case was done. As the carriage pulled away into the fog, Holmes couldn't help but think of the one thing he hadn't said, the thing that lingered in the back of his mind. There was no undoing what had been done, but there was always another mystery, always another case waiting to be solved. And that perhaps was the only thing that could bring him peace.